Welcome back. So in this video, we'll be writing a code to write our own implementation of a promise, or we'll be writing a polyfill for a promise. So promise is something that helps you to write asynchronous codes and also lets you know when an asynchronous operation is done, is completed, and whether it is a success or whether it is a failure. So we'll see an example first. So if we if we use a promise that is given to us by JavaScript itself, the code will look like this. We initialize a promise, we give in a resolve and reject callback function, and then when the promise is done, we resolve. That means we complete the promise by giving a value high, that is the resultant data. And when the promise is done, we console log the data, and then we return another data, which in turn gets logged here. So we are chaining a promise here. So if I log the result, I'll see a promise pending because here the promise is pending, and then I later on see high and world. First high gets resolved. This data gets passed in this then function, and then I return another world, which in turn invokes another callback function, another then, which logs another data, which is world, hi world. So we'll be writing an implementation of this ourselves, and we'll see how promise are internally implemented and what are the know-hows of promise. So let's replace this promise with our custom promise and then initialize a constructor. So in constructor, we know that a promise takes a function. A promise takes a function, and we will call this entire function as an executor function. Let's call this function as an executor function. Now, we know that promises has states. Promise have a state. So let's say I copy this. Let's say I run this code and I console log this promise. I'll see that the promise is in pending state. But if I change this code and I just like directly return something, I directly resolve this, I will see I will see that the promise is fulfilled. So promise has three states. One is pending, when the promise is not yet completed. Another is promise is fulfilled when the promise has succeeded. And the third is rejected when the promise has thrown some error. So if I just reject this thing, it will be rejected. So promise has three states. So I'll just initialize a state variable here and I'll call it pending. I'll just initialize it with pending because promise is pending until and unless the the operation is done. Now I will call the executor function. An executor function, this is an executor function because this is passed as in the constructor when it is invoked, and this takes in two methods, resolve and reject. So we initialize resolve and reject here. Const resolve. This is a function, and this resolve function, as you can see, resolve function is taking some data here. So I'll also pass in data, and I'll initialize another value, and I'll keep it as empty initially, and then after this I set the value as data. So as to retain the data which is being passed in resolve. Similarly, we'll initialize reject. Reject also has some kind of data. Reject also has some kind of data. So I'll pass in data, and I'll also assign this dot value equal to data. So this is fine. We have done this. And when the promise is resolved, we also need to mark the state. So the state will be fulfilled in case promise is resolved, in case the promise is success, and the state here will be rejected in case the promise ends in a failure. Now we'll also wrap this inside a try catch. Why try catch? Let's say this executor function, when calling this function, it resulted in some kind of error. So we want this to be able to get executed in catch, and here we'll just say we'll just console log here. What's the error? Error error. In case it does end up in getting some error, we'll just console log it here. So our basic boilerplate code is done. We also need some kind of handlers. I'll initialize a handlers array. So what are handlers? Handlers are these, whatever you call in them. So this is a handler function. This is a handler function. So whenever a promise is either fulfilled, we pass in a handler function that needs to be invoked when a promise is fulfilled. Here I can also write catch. So, and in this catch, I can also write this handler function. So this means that whenever a promise is either fulfilled, if a promise is fulfilled, I need to invoke this handler function, and then in turn, I also need to invoke this handler function if this promise is also fulfilled. But if the promise is rejected, I need to call this handler function. So I'll just create a handler array to just store all the functions that needs to be executed depending on the state of the promise. So this is cool. This is really cool. And then I'll declare a then method. So a custom promise has a then method and a catch method. So let's declare these then and catch methods. Now then method has a handler. So I'll call this handler, and this then should return a promise. This then also returns a promise because I can also call then on this then method. So it should return a promise. So we'll just return our new custom promise. New custom promise. The custom promise takes in a result and a reject, as we have seen above. Now we will pass in the handlers method to handler. And what we'll pass in handler, and we'll also pass in resolve reject. Because we'll need this resolve and reject whenever we are calling this handler function, whenever we are calling this function, whenever we are invoking this function, we would also need the resolve and reject because this is also in promise, right? And this promise also needs to either resolve or reject. So we'll also store resolve and reject along with handler. Awesome. Now whenever this function is called, we need to also call the handlers, run handlers. We'll declare this handlers function. Let's also create a catch. Catch also has a handler, and this will also be almost similar to this. We'll just pass in handler, resolve, reject, and run handlers. Awesome. That is great. Now let's create our handlers, run handlers function. Run handlers. Now first we will check what's the state of the promise. If the state of the promise is pending, we'll just return. We don't want anything, we don't want to run anything when a promise is in pending state. Now we'll loop over the handlers for each handler index. Now we'll destructure all the things that are there in handler. What's there in handler? Let's call this a function. Since the name might get confused, I'll just call this a function, call by function. So we'll destructure call by function, resolve, and reject from handler. All right, so we have all these. Now we will check what's the value of state. If state is fulfilled. Now, if the promise state is fulfilled, what we need to do is we need to call resolve function because a state is fulfilled, we need to call resolve function, and we need to call resolve function with the value. Remember what the value was? What the value was the data which we were passing in the resolve. So here we were passing high, so we need to call this thing, we need to call the resolve function with the value provided, right? Awesome. In fact, we need to call the callback function here. We need to call the callback function. We need to call this function with the data which was provided with this data. So we need to call this function with the data, and this will return a result. And then we will resolve the entire promise with the result. Awesome. We'll copy this thing. Else if If the state is rejected, we call the callback function again, and then here, but we will reject with result. Awesome. I think this is entirely it. I'll just name this thing callback function again, and callback function. Awesome. We also need one more thing here. What's that? Is when we call resolve, we also need to call the handlers because whenever a promise is resolved, we need to call the handlers because if I clear this thing again, if I run this thing, it doesn't do anything because promise or done is not a function. So let's call the handlers here. Let's see what's if there's an error or not. So we see that custom promise there. Let's see what console log we have. Console log error, promise. Let's remove this promise. We have data, we have data, we have data. I'll just remove this thing for now. I'll comment this out and I'll run this. So we can see that it is working as expected. It is giving me high and it is giving me world first. Now let's say I return an error here, or I just throw a new error here. Error, error. Let's see. And then do a catch. Then see what happens. And it threw an error. User threw error, error dot for each. So it's throwing an error. It should have been caught here. It should have been caught here. I'll just console log this in catch block. It should have been present in the catch block. Let's see. Okay, it isn't there in the catch block. Let's see what's wrong. So I'll just return this thing. Return new error in cache block. So it's there in cache block. We are there. So it's working as expected. Uh, so first the promise is executed and then so I realized we did a couple of mistakes here. One mistake was that whether a promise was fulfilled or rejected, it was calling both then and catch, which is kind of wrong. Why was it getting called twice? Is we have a common function here, callback function. We earlier had a callback function, and since we had a callback function here and here, what we were doing is we were calling the callback function. We were calling the same callback function whether the promise was fulfilled or whether the promise was rejected, which is wrong, right? Because we want to call a separate function when a promise is fulfilled, and we want to call a separate function when a promise is rejected. So we don't want to name the function same thing. So I just renamed this as on fulfilled and on rejected, so we can have a way to segregate whether a promise was a success or a failure. And then we checked here that if the state is fulfilled and we have a non-fulfilled function, that means we have this function here, right here, then we'll call this function. And if the state is rejected and we have a rejected function right here, then we'll call this function. So we have this right here. So I'll just call this and also wrap this entire thing in the try catch because let's say if this function internally throws an error, then we reject the entire thing altogether. Now I just run this and see if it works, and we are sure that it works now. It is first high and then in cache block because it throws an error, right? So let's say it. I just return something here. I don't return an error, and let's see if it goes into cache block. Okay, it doesn't go in cache block because there is no error. So I think it works fine. There are many ways like we can like there could be other edge cases as well, right? So this is just a basic implementation of promise. It doesn't handle all the edge cases, and we can iterate upon the cases as we implement this further. So let me know what edge cases you need to handle, and I can check this. Thank you.